some don't realize they are in a rut when it starts. There's no dramatic moment where life announces, this is the downturn. It usually begins subtly. Motivation fades a little. Effort feels heavier than it used to. The same problems keep looping, not big enough to be catastrophic, but persistent enough to drain you. And at some point, you start using language that hints at something deeper. You say things like, I'm just stuck, or nothing ever works out for me, or I must have bad luck. Some people call it a rut. Some call it bad karma. Others call it bad luck. But underneath the label, the experience is surprisingly universal. What's interesting is that humans have always tried to explain these phases. Ancient cultures talked about fate or divine punishment. Eastern philosophies framed it as karma, actions echoing forward in time. Modern psychology talks about learned helplessness, cognitive bias, and feedback loops. Different words, same phenomenon, a period where effort doesn't seem to translate into results, and hope starts to erode. The danger isn't the rut itself. Ruts are inevitable. Every life that unfolds over decades will contain stretches where progress stalls. The real danger is the story we tell ourselves while we're in it. When people believe they are cursed by bad luck or weighed down by bad karma, they stop looking closely at cause and effect. They begin to see randomness as personal. A missed opportunity becomes proof. A rejection becomes confirmation. Over time, the brain starts filtering reality in a very specific way. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, the tendency to notice evidence that supports what we already believe and ignore what doesn't. If you believe you're unlucky, you'll notice every setback and overlook every quiet win. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your behavior begins to change. You try less. You expect less. You risk less. Which, statistically speaking, produces fewer positive outcomes. What feels like bad luck often turns out to be a self-reinforcing loop. There's research backing this up. Studies on learned helplessness, first observed in animals and later in humans, show that when individuals experience repeated failure they can't control, they eventually stop trying even when success becomes possible again. The nervous system adapts to disappointment by conserving energy. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes sense. But in modern life, it can trap people for years. That's why getting out of a rut is rarely about a single breakthrough moment. It's not about thinking positive or waiting for the universe to realign. It's about interrupting patterns, internal and external, one small, deliberate step at a time. One of the most overlooked truths about bad phases is this: they distort time. When you're stuck, everything feels permanent. But when you look backward, you realize how temporary even the longest slumps actually were. Neuroscience shows that stress narrows our sense of time and possibility. The brain goes into threat mode, prioritizing short-term survival over long-term imagination. This is why people in ruts struggle to envision a different future, not because it's impossible, but because their nervous system isn't optimized for hope at that moment. So the first step isn't fixing your life. It's stabilizing your system. Sleep matters more than people want to admit. So does sunlight, movement, and nutrition. These aren't cliches, they are biological levers. Chronic stress elevates cortisol, which impairs decision-making, memory, and emotional regulation. You cannot reason your way out of a rut with a dysregulated nervous system. That's not weakness, that's physiology. Getting over bad luck often starts with boring, unglamorous acts of self-regulation that don't feel heroic but create the conditions for clarity. Once the system stabilizes, perspective begins to widen. This is where philosophy becomes practical. Stoic philosophers like Epictetus argued that suffering comes less from events themselves and more from our judgments about them. That doesn't mean events don't hurt. It means that interpreting every setback as personal failure adds a second layer of pain that compounds over time. Modern cognitive behavioral therapy echoes this idea almost word for word. Thoughts shape emotional responses, which shape behavior. Change the interpretation, and you change the trajectory. But here's the nuance most motivational advice misses: you don't replace negative beliefs with blind optimism. You replace them with accuracy. Instead of, "I have bad luck," the accurate statement might be, "I'm in a low probability phase right now, and my current strategy isn't producing results." That sentence doesn't feel inspiring, but it's empowering. Because strategies can be adjusted. Probability shifts with volume and time. And phases, by definition, end. Bad karma, when examined honestly, is often just unresolved patterns. Repeated relationship failures might point to unexamined boundaries. Financial instability might reflect avoidance rather than fate. Career stagnation might reveal a skills gap rather than a curse. This isn't about self-blame. It's about reclaiming agency. Karma doesn't mean punishment, it means consequence. And consequences can change when behavior changes. One of the hardest parts of climbing out of a rut is accepting how small the first steps need to be. When people are stuck, they tend to overcorrect mentally. They imagine radical transformations, new cities, new identities, dramatic reinventions. But research on habit formation shows that consistency beats intensity every time. Tiny wins rebuild trust in yourself. And self-trust is the real currency of momentum. There's a reason why therapists often focus on routine before ambition. Routines create predictability, and predictability calms the brain. Once the brain feels safe, creativity and risk-taking return naturally. You don't force momentum, you allow it. Another uncomfortable truth, some ruts last longer because they are trying to teach you something you keep avoiding. Not in a mystical sense, but in a psychological one. Humans are remarkably skilled at distraction. We can outrun discomfort with noise, entertainment, substances, or busyness. But unresolved grief, resentment, fear, or shame doesn't disappear. It waits. And when it accumulates, life starts feeling heavy for reasons we can't articulate. Getting unstuck often requires stillness before action. Honest reflection before strategy. Asking questions like, what am I avoiding? What am I tolerating that's quietly draining me? What decision have I delayed because it scares me? These aren't comfortable questions, but they are clarifying ones. It's also important to recognize that not all bad luck is personal, and not all effort pays off immediately. Survivorship bias makes success stories look cleaner than they are. We rarely hear about the years of stagnation behind them. Economists refer to this as the long tail of effort, where outcomes lag behind input by months or years. If you quit during the lag, it feels like bad luck. If you persist through it, it looks like destiny in hindsight. This is why patience isn't passive. It's an active skill. It requires discipline, emotional regulation, and trust in process without constant reassurance. Few people master it, which is why those who do often appear unusually lucky. And then there's meaning. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist who survived concentration camps, observed that people who could attach meaning to suffering were more resilient than those who couldn't. Meaning doesn't remove pain, but it gives it direction. A rut endured consciously becomes a chapter, not a verdict. Eventually, something shifts. Not dramatically. Quietly. A conversation lands differently. A small opportunity appears. Energy returns in fragments. And because you've rebuilt awareness and agency, you notice it. You respond instead of dismissing it. Momentum doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. Looking back, most people realize that their worst stretches reshaped them in ways comfort never could. Not because suffering is good, but because attention is sharpened when things aren't working. Priorities clarify. Illusions fall away. The rut becomes a recalibration rather than a punishment. So if you're in one now, feeling unlucky, stuck, or weighed down by invisible forces, understand this: you are not broken. You are in a process. And processes respond to patience, honesty, and consistent action far more than they respond to despair or magical thinking. Bad luck passes. Karma evolves. Ruts end. But the person you become while navigating them, that part stays. And often, that's the part that finally changes everything. What people rarely talk about is how uneven that transformation actually feels while it's happening. Growth during a rut doesn't arrive as confidence or clarity. It shows up as hesitation, second-guessing, and long stretches where nothing seems to improve on the surface. You're still tired. You're still unsure. But something subtle is shifting underneath. Your tolerance for illusion weakens. Things that once distracted you no longer work. And while that can feel like loss, it's often the first sign that your attention is reorganizing around what actually matters. One of the quiet changes that happens in prolonged difficulty is a recalibration of values. When life is comfortable, it's easy to chase symbols, status, approval, appearances, momentum for its own sake. When those symbols stop delivering relief, the mind starts asking different questions. What actually restores me? What drains me consistently? Who do I feel more like myself around, and who do I shrink near? These questions don't appear during success because they don't need to. They surface when the old rewards fail. That's not bad luck. That's feedback. Another shift happens in how you relate to effort. Early in life, effort is often transactional. You work hard, you expect results. When the results don't come, frustration builds. But extended ruts teach a deeper lesson: effort is not always rewarded immediately, and sometimes it isn't rewarded in the way you expect at all. This forces a more mature relationship with work itself. You begin to act based on alignment rather than outcome. You show up not because you're guaranteed a payoff, but because the act of showing up stabilizes you. This is where discipline stops being about motivation and starts being about identity. There's also a humbling realization that arrives at some point: no one is coming to pull you out. Not because people don't care, but because most people are absorbed in their own private battles. This can feel isolating at first, but eventually, it becomes liberating. When you stop waiting for rescue, external validation, sudden opportunity, perfect timing, you reclaim responsibility in a quieter, steadier way. You begin making choices not to fix everything, but to reduce friction. To remove what consistently harms you. To protect your energy with more intention than before. Ruts also change how you interpret other people's lives. When you've been through one, success stories stop looking as glamorous, and failure stops looking as shameful. You start to see timing, support systems, unseen effort, and psychological readiness behind outcomes. This perspective makes you less bitter and less impressed at the same time. You stop comparing trajectories because you understand how non-linear progress actually is. And that understanding creates compassion, for yourself first, and then for others. One of the most underappreciated skills developed during a long rut is emotional endurance. Not resilience in the motivational sense, but the ability to sit with discomfort without immediately needing to escape it. This matters more than people realize. Many destructive decisions are not made because someone lacked intelligence or opportunity, but because they couldn't tolerate uncertainty long enough for clarity to form. Learning to remain present when answers aren't available builds a kind of internal steadiness that success alone rarely teaches. Over time, your relationship with hope changes too. It becomes quieter, less dramatic. You stop expecting inspiration to arrive fully formed. Instead, you notice small signs of movement and treat them seriously. A single good conversation. A day with slightly more energy. A moment where you respond instead of react. These don't look like turning points, but they are. They signal that the system is recalibrating, that trust in yourself is slowly being restored. Eventually, you may realize that the rut didn't remove things from your life as much as it revealed which things were unsustainable. Certain ambitions, identities, or attachments only survive under ideal conditions. When pressure arrives, they collapse. What remains is usually simpler, sturdier, and more honest. And while that simplicity can feel like loss at first, it often becomes the foundation for a life that requires less constant repair. When momentum does return, and it usually does, it arrives differently than before. There's less urgency to prove yourself. Less attachment to outcomes you can't control. You move forward with a measured confidence rooted in experience rather than optimism. You know what it feels like when things don't work, and you survived it. That knowledge stays with you. It becomes a quiet form of insurance against future setbacks. So if progress feels slow, or invisible, or strangely anticlimactic, that doesn't mean nothing is happening.